Behind the spotlight, 8 Hollywood legends and their hidden battles, some of the most beloved faces in American entertainment, carried a secret the cameras never fully caught. Behind the laughter, the glamour, and the perfectly timed punchlines, 8 legends were fighting private wars with addiction. Wars that studios enabled, doctors fed, and fame made nearly impossible to escape. These are not rumors. These are their own words, their families' accounts, and the medical records history left behind. This is the story of what fame cost, starting with the night one of comedy's greatest voices very nearly didn't survive it. Actor number 1, Richard Pryor. June 9, 1980. A quiet street in Northridge, California, was about to become the backdrop to one of the most harrowing nights in Hollywood history. Richard Pryor was, by then, the most influential stand-up comedian in America, a man who had turned his own pain into some of the sharpest material ever performed on a stage. But off-camera, Pryor had developed a dangerous relationship with a new and volatile drug ritual sweeping through 1970s and 80s Hollywood, freebasing. The process involved cooking cocaine with a flammable solvent, typically ether, to purify it into a smokable form that delivered an intense, immediate high straight to the brain. That night, inside his home, something went catastrophically wrong. The volatile mixture ignited. Pryor was suddenly engulfed, his body on fire. In a moment of sheer panic, he ran from the house and down the street, flames consuming his clothing and skin, until police finally managed to subdue him. He suffered first, second, and third-degree burns across roughly half his body. Doctors gave him only a 1 in 3 chance of survival. For 12 agonizing hours, arson investigators found no drugs or flammable chemicals in his home. The scene had already been altered before they arrived. But Pryor himself told doctors treating him exactly what happened. He'd been freebasing when the ether ignited. His family later confirmed he'd been in the grip of a drug-fueled crisis that night. Astonishingly, Pryor survived. Even more astonishing was what came next. He turned the near-fatal incident into material. In his 1982 concert film and Grammy-winning album Live on the Sunset Strip, Pryor addressed the fire directly, first joking that it had been caused by dunking a cookie in a glass of low-fat milk before pivoting into a raw, unflinching account of his addiction. It became one of the most celebrated stand-up performances ever recorded. Comedy built directly on top of trauma most people would never speak about publicly, let alone turn into art. Pryor had been open about cocaine use even before the fire, and the incident became something the entire industry, and eventually the public, could not ignore. It was Hollywood's dirty secrets suddenly rendered impossible to hide, captured not in a tabloid photo, but in the scorched pavement of a residential street and the third-degree burns that would mark Pryor's body for the rest of his life. He would go on to perform for another 2 decades, direct a semi-autobiographical film revolving around the incident, Joe Dancer, Your Life is Calling, and receive the Kennedy Center's Mark Twain Prize before his death in 2005, following a long battle with multiple sclerosis diagnosed 6 years after the fire. What makes Pryor's story so remarkable isn't just that he survived a night that should have killed him. It's that he chose deliberately to drag the darkest moment of his life into the light and let an audience laugh and wince alongside him. But Pryor wasn't the only performer of that era hiding a chemical dependency behind a headline-grabbing image. Nearly a decade before Pryor's fire, on the very same network where he'd later crack jokes about it, another star was quietly unraveling. A woman whose addiction had begun not in adulthood, but as a child, at the hands of the very studio that made her famous. Actor number 2, Judy Garland. To understand Judy Garland's final years, you have to go back to a version of her most people never saw. A 10-year-old girl, already working brutal hours on a studio lot, already being handed pills by the adults responsible for her. According to biographer Gerald Clark, it was Garland's own mother, Ethel Gum, who first gave her daughter medication for energy and later for sleep, before she'd even turned 10. When MGM signed Garland as a teenager, the studio system took over where her mother left off. To keep up with grueling production schedules, executives supplied pep pills, amphetamines, to power through 18-hour days, followed by barbiturates to force sleep once filming wrapped. By the time she finished shooting The Wizard of Oz at 17, Garland was already addicted to both. Studio head Louis B. Mayer, according to multiple accounts, was also relentlessly critical of Garland's weight, at one point reportedly calling the 4'11" star, "fat little pig with pigtails." That pressure, combined with the chemical regimen the studio itself had created, set the pattern for the rest of her life. Appetite suppressed by stimulants, exhaustion chased away by more stimulants, and barbiturates deployed nightly to force her mind to finally stop. Garland later described her adolescence in devastating terms. "My life was a combination of absolute chaos and absolute solitude." By 27, she'd suffered a nervous breakdown and was released from her MGM contract after 15 years and more than 30 films. The addiction never left her. Decades later, when Garland appeared as a guest on The Tonight Show, she was performing, literally and figuratively, while still cycling through the same drugs that had defined her since childhood. Reports from the era describe a performer prone to sudden shifts, manic energy giving way to disorientation, brilliant moments of wit undercut by visible fragility. On June 22, 1969, Judy Garland was found dead in the bathroom of her London home. The cause was an accidental barbiturate overdose. She was 47 years old and had been struggling with addiction for more than 30 of those years, dating back to a childhood that was never really allowed to be one. Garland's death sent shockwaves through the industry, but perhaps nowhere more personally than into the life of her own daughter, a rising Broadway and film star who watched her mother's addiction consume her, and who, within the same year, would begin walking a strikingly similar path. Actor number 3, Liza Minnelli. Liza Minnelli was 23 years old when her mother died, and according to Minnelli herself, that was the moment her own addiction truly began. In the aftermath of Judy Garland's death, Minnelli was prescribed Valium, a benzodiazepine commonly given for anxiety in that era, with little understanding at the time of how dangerously addictive it could become. What started as grief medication spiraled into decades of dependency on both alcohol and prescription pills. "My whole life, this disease has been rampant," Minnelli said in a 2004 interview with The Guardian. "I inherited it, and it's been horrendous, but I have always asked for help." That willingness to seek treatment became one of the defining threads of her adult life. In the 1980s, she checked into the Betty Ford Center, the same institution where Elizabeth Taylor and countless other stars sought recovery, and later returned to a normal touring and performing schedule. She was candid, sometimes strikingly so, about just how dangerous the withdrawal process could be. "What really almost did me in was the Valium," she told Good Morning America's David Hartman in 1985. "If anybody has got a dependency on Valium, be really careful, because the withdrawal is horrendous." But recovery for Minnelli was never a single moment, it was a recurring battle. She also sought treatment at the Caron Foundation in Pennsylvania and returned to rehab as recently as 2015, at age 69, primarily for alcohol issues, following a back surgery that had sidelined her performing career. Her representative at the time described her as making excellent progress, language that echoed the careful, guarded way the industry had learned to talk about addiction by then, a stark contrast to how little protection her mother had been given decades earlier. What makes Minnelli's story so striking is the direct line it draws between generations. She won an Oscar, a Tony, an Emmy, and a Grammy, one of the rare EGOT-adjacent performers in history, all while carrying the same genetic and psychological vulnerability to addiction that had defined and ultimately ended her mother's life. She has spoken about that inheritance not with shame, but as something she has fought, relapsed against, and fought again, in full view of the public her mother once performed for under an entirely different kind of pressure. If Garland and Minnelli's stories show how addiction could be quietly built into a childhood, one of their contemporaries proved that even a star with none of that early studio history could spend 3 decades locked in the exact same fight, using the same substances, the same rehab facility, and ultimately becoming the very first celebrity to speak about it publicly. Actor number 4, Elizabeth Taylor. By 1981, Elizabeth Taylor's addiction had reached a level almost impossible to comprehend. In a single year, 3 of her doctors wrote a combined total of roughly 300 prescriptions for around 30 different controlled substances. According to David Haymon's 1995 biography, Liz Taylor at times consumed what he described as enough medication to fuel an army. For a birthday party thrown for her close friend Michael Jackson in 1982, she reportedly received 600 pills. Her son, Chris Wilding, later wrote about the toll this took at home. He described walking in on his mother preparing a Demerol injection, a powerful opioid painkiller, and refusing to hand her the syringe when she asked. She injected herself anyway. Taylor's substance use dated back decades, intertwined with a long history of injuries and illnesses, including hospitalization for staphylococcus pneumonia in the early 1960s, worsened by a combination of alcohol and the sleep aid Seconal. Her struggles with alcohol trace back at least to her marriage to actor Richard Burton, who battled his own well-documented alcoholism. On December 5, 1983, At 51 years old, Taylor made history by voluntarily checking into the newly opened Betty Ford Center, becoming the first celebrity to publicly acknowledge treatment there. Her stay lasted 7 weeks and focused on both alcohol and prescription drug addiction. She stopped drinking, but she continued taking pills, rationalizing them as legitimate medication because a doctor had prescribed them. She relapsed the following year after the death of her ex-husband Richard Burton. In 1988, following treatment for a broken back, she returned to the Betty Ford Center for a second stay, this time after an intervention staged by her family, including her son Wilding. "We were all petrified," he later said. It was during this second stint that she met her eighth and final husband, construction worker Larry Fortensky, whom she married in 1991. By 1990, the scale of her prescription drug use became a matter of public record. A Los Angeles District Attorney investigation found that 3 of Taylor's doctors had written a combined 1,000 prescriptions for 28 different controlled substances between 1983 and 1988 alone, years she was supposedly already managing her recovery. Taylor later spoke openly about her time in treatment, describing it as the first time in her life she felt she wasn't being exploited. "I felt really for the first time in my life I wasn't being exploited by anyone," she said. "I was being accepted for myself." Her openness helped normalize addiction treatment for an entire generation of celebrities who would follow her into the same Rancho Mirage facility. But while Taylor fought her battle largely out of the public eye until her 1983 admission, one performer just one generation behind her would grow up entirely inside the era Taylor helped create, a Star Wars icon whose own struggle would only become fully, shockingly clear after her death. Actor number 5, Carrie Fisher. Carrie Fisher was 21 years old and playing Princess Leia in The Empire Strikes Back when, by her own later admission, cocaine was part of daily life on set. "We did cocaine on the set of Empire in the Ice Planet," she revealed while touring with her memoir in 2010, a stunning admission about one of the most iconic productions in film history. Fisher's relationship with substances was, by her own account, deeply tied to an undiagnosed mental health condition. She wasn't diagnosed as bipolar until 1980, at age 24, years after she'd already been self-medicating with a wide range of drugs. "I never could take alcohol," she told the Herald Tribune in 2013. "By the time I was 21, it was LSD. I didn't love cocaine, but I wanted to feel any way other than the way I did, so I'd do anything." According to a National Geographic excerpt drawn from her writing, Fisher experienced what she described as a constant tsunami of thoughts and feelings, and found that LSD transformed the spinning inner monologue into visual hallucinations that felt, to her, more manageable. Among prescription drugs, she favored Percocet, an opioid painkiller, and once admitted to taking as many as 30 pills a day just to quiet her mind. She overdosed at 28. That overdose became a turning point, convincing her that addiction itself, not just her undiagnosed mental illness, was a problem she needed to confront directly. She dedicated herself to sobriety, but soon found her underlying bipolar symptoms resurfacing without the substances that had been masking them. Rather than hide any of this, Fisher built an entire creative career around radical honesty about it. Her semi-autobiographical novel Postcards from the Edge became a film starring Meryl Streep as a recovering addict. Her one-woman show and memoir Wishful Drinking tackled her addiction and bipolar disorder with the same sharp, self-deprecating wit that made her famous as Leia, turning what could have been tabloid material into some of the most quoted mental health advocacy of her generation. Fisher died on December 27, 2016, days after suffering a massive cardiac episode on a flight from London to Los Angeles. The final autopsy report, released months later, revealed a combination of drugs in her system, including cocaine, heroin, methadone, and opiates, though the coroner's office stated it could not determine exactly what role, if any, the substances played in her death. It was a haunting postscript to a life she had spent trying to demystify for the public. Fisher had spoken about her addiction for decades with unusual candor, yet the full chemical picture of her final hours only became public knowledge after she was gone. Not every star of her era was so forthcoming. One leading man of the same period spent years letting the world believe he was dying of an entirely different disease, anything rather than admit what the pills were actually for. Actor number 6, Burt Reynolds. In 1984, on the set of the film City Heat, a stunt went catastrophically wrong. Reynolds was struck in the face with a metal chair, reportedly a prop that should have been a breakaway piece but turned out to be solid, and the blow shattered his jaw. The injury developed into a severe case of temporomandibular joint disorder, or TMJ, a condition causing relentless, debilitating jaw pain that made eating anything solid nearly impossible. Reynolds later described surviving on liquids sipped through a straw before eventually giving up on eating almost entirely. His weight collapsed from around 200 pounds down to roughly 160 to 170, a loss of 30 to 40 pounds, depending on the account. The physical transformation was so dramatic that tabloids began speculating Reynolds was secretly dying of AIDS, a rumor that dogged him for years during a period he later called simply awful. He forced himself to keep working, in part just to publicly disprove the gossip. Behind the rumors was a different, quieter crisis. To manage the chronic pain, Reynolds became dependent on the sedative Halcion, at the peak of his addiction reportedly taking up to 50 pills a day, an amount that would be lethal for most people, but which for Reynolds had become simply the price of functioning. According to his own memoir, the dependency crept up on him gradually. "I was hooked before I even knew it," he admitted. At one especially dangerous point, he came close to a fatal overdose and reportedly slipped into a coma, an episode that ultimately broke his physical dependence on Halcion, though it did nothing to resolve the underlying pain that had caused it. The chronic pain and addiction cycle would return decades later. After back surgery in 2009, Reynolds again found himself dependent on prescription painkillers. This time, older and more self-aware, he checked himself into a rehab facility in Florida, a decision he said he hoped might help others recognize the same warning signs in themselves. Reynolds went on to battle serious cardiovascular problems in his later years, including quintuple heart bypass surgery and a heart attack, both in 2010, alongside ongoing struggles with depression. He died of cardiac arrest on September 6, 2018, at age 82, a death that, unlike the AIDS rumors of the 1980s, had nothing mysterious about it at all. For years, the public believed the worst possible explanation for Reynolds' decline, while the real story, chronic pain, prescription dependency, and a body pushed to its absolute limit by physical comedy and stunt work, went largely unspoken. He wasn't the only performer of that era whose off-camera pain was hidden behind physical comedy. One SNL original built an entire career on falling down for laughs, until the accumulated damage from those very falls led him down a strikingly similar road. Actor number 7, Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase's rise to fame was built, quite literally, on falling down. As the breakout star of Saturday Night Live's original 1975 cast, his signature pratfalls became appointment television, and over years, accumulated real, physical damage. One incident stood out. During a Gerald Ford impression sketch, Chase was supposed to tumble safely over a padded podium. The podium, however, hadn't actually been padded. He missed 2 episodes recovering from the resulting injury. It was one of many stunts that, over the course of years, left him with chronic, long-term back problems. To manage that pain, Chase was prescribed painkillers, and by the mid-1980s, the dependency had become serious enough that, in October 1986, at 43 years old, he voluntarily checked into the Betty Ford Center. His spokeswoman at the time, Pat Kingsley, told reporters the treatment addressed a dependency on prescription drugs relating to chronic and long-term back problems stemming directly from his years of stunts on SNL. Chase later offered a somewhat more candid and more complicated account of that era himself. In a 2010 interview with Esquire, he described his drug use as comparatively low-level, saying, "I never shot things up or freebased. I checked myself into the Betty Ford clinic after my nose started to hurt," a reference suggesting cocaine use alongside the painkiller dependency his publicist had described. A 2026 CNN documentary, "I'm Chevy Chase and You're Not," later expanded on this further, with people close to him, including his brother and a longtime producer, describing a more extensive struggle with cocaine that an intervention from his doctor and his wife, Janie, ultimately helped push him toward treatment for. Chase's recovery was not a single, permanent turning point. 3 decades later, in 2016, at age 72, he checked into the Hazelden Addiction Treatment Center in Minnesota, this time for alcohol. His representative described it simply as a tune-up to his ongoing recovery, language that reflected both how far addiction treatment had come in public perception since Elizabeth Taylor's groundbreaking 1983 admission, and how addiction, even successfully managed, rarely disappears for good. What connects Chase's story to so many of the others on this list isn't just the substances or the shared address in Rancho Mirage, it's the origin. A body pushed past its limits for the sake of entertainment, pain treated with pills, and pills that, for a performer already living under constant public pressure, became their own kind of trap. But if Chase's addiction grew slowly out of physical injury, one entertainer's decline moved on an entirely different, more chaotic timeline, fueled not by pain, but by grief, isolation, and an industry that simply looked the other way. Actor number 8, Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. built his reputation on sheer, relentless energy, a performer who sang, danced, and joked his way through some of the most segregated stages in America, often unable to stay in the very hotels where he headlined. But behind that stamina was a decades-long battle with alcohol, and later, cocaine that even his closest collaborators in the Rat Pack found alarming. According to Davis's own 1989 autobiography, Why Me?, the Sammy Davis Jr. story is addiction intensified through the 1960s and 70s following the collapse of his marriage to Swedish actress May Britt, a relationship that had already drawn death threats and intense public scrutiny for its interracial pairing in an era when that alone was considered scandalous. The end of that marriage, following an affair Davis admitted to, pushed him further into drinking. The mid-1970s marked what biographers describe as his heaviest period of substance abuse. Davis's Los Angeles home reportedly became a regular party destination fueled by whiskey, cocaine, and amyl nitrite, with guests including major rock musicians of the era. His cocaine use, according to multiple accounts, became totally out of control during this stretch, coinciding with an equally reckless personal life that further strained his relationships and reputation. The toll on his body eventually became undeniable. Davis drank so heavily that doctors diagnosed him with a diseased liver and warned him plainly, another drink could kill him. Remarkably, he listened. He gave up alcohol completely, though he continued smoking, a habit that would ultimately contribute to the throat cancer that killed him in 1990, at age 64. Quitting cocaine came somewhat earlier, though accounts describe it as a gradual withdrawal from the excess of the era rather than a single dramatic intervention. Even as his substance use declined, financial devastation followed him into his final years. By the 1980s, Davis reportedly owed the IRS millions of dollars, the product of decades of extravagant spending during his years of heaviest use. Davis's daughter, Tracy, has spoken publicly about her father's ability to keep moving forward despite everything stacked against him: the addiction, the racism he endured throughout his career, and the immense financial and personal pressure of maintaining a public image built on non-stop performance. "I think the biggest triumph of my dad was that he never got bitter and he never got down," she said, reflecting on a career defined as much by resilience as by the private struggles that shadowed it. 8 legends. 8 different substances, 8 different reasons, 8 different roads into addiction, a chronic pain injury, a childhood spent under studio control, a marriage's collapse, an inherited vulnerability passed from mother to daughter. What united all of them wasn't just the drugs, or even the fame. It was an industry that, for decades, quietly enabled the very dependencies it later punished them for having, and a generation of performers who, in their own words and their own time, chose to tell the truth about what that cost them. What do you think? Which of these 8 stories affected you the most? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history behind Hollywood's golden age.